The roadside diner in Red Pines was almost empty when he walked in. A stillness so deep that secrets seemed to echo louder than human voices, and as he took his seat with the hem of his long black coat brushing the floor and those cold steel-like eyes surveying the room, the atmosphere shifted in an instant because everyone in town knew who he was. He was the kind of man you avoided staring at for too long if you wanted to keep your life peaceful. Yet, the waitress was different. Not because she was brave, but because she saw what no one else noticed. The faint tremor in his hand, the uneven breath, the pale red shade creeping slowly up his neck like the first warning of something lethal, poison, and with just one glance at the cup of coffee and a wisp of steam carrying the faint scent of bitter almonds, Claire Bennett understood that someone was trying to kill him, and that the person responsible had to be someone very close. And as he tried to stand, his vision blurred, the room tilted, and darkness rose around him, until she murmured, "Look at me," in a voice strangely calm despite the terror flickering in her eyes, and before he collapsed, she caught his face between her hands, lifted it gently, and pressed her mouth to his. While the entire diner held its breath and a few startled customers gasped in shock and confusion, because to an outsider it looked reckless, impulsive, even mad. But she was not kissing him. She was forcing him to breathe, pulling the poisoned air from his lungs before it could finish its deadly work, and when she pulled away, he crumpled into her arms, still alive, trembling, disoriented, and in that very moment, as three men in dark suits burst into the diner, with guns drawn and eyes sweeping the room like a storm about to break, Nathan Cross, the man whose name people only dared to whisper, understood the truth, that no ally had ever saved him this way, no enemy had ever come this close to ending him, and no woman had ever altered the course of his life with nothing more than a single breath, and what happened after that desperate almost kiss would forever change the fate of them both. So do not look away, because what follows will make you reconsider loyalty, love, and danger. In the heavy air of the diner, still thick with tension, and the ragged breaths of people who had just brushed against the edge of life and death, if you are following this story and feel your own heartbeat quickening with every passing moment, take a single breath and a single second to subscribe to our channel, to press like and share this video so you will not miss any of the perilous and mysterious moments that lie ahead, and let me know where you are watching from. Leave a comment below with the place where you are listening to this story, so we can see just how far the journey of Claire and Nathan has reached, because even the smallest gesture from you is enough to help us continue bringing you stories that grow more gripping and more thrilling with each passing day. The sound of guns being drawn filled the air at the same moment the remaining customers in the small roadside diner erupted into frightened cries, and Claire stayed kneeling beside Nathan with her breath unsteady and her hand pressed against his chest to feel the fragile rhythm of a heartbeat that had only just returned, when the door burst open again and three men in black suits stormed inside with eyes cold enough to destroy anything in their path, the tallest one with a faint scar along his left cheek, moving straight toward Claire and Nathan while the other two spread out to secure the room, their gazes sweeping over every patron as if searching for the smallest trace of danger. And though Claire had no idea what was happening, her body reacted before her mind did, and she raised both hands, palms slick with cold sweat, while Nathan lay limp in her arms with his eyes shut, his lips dry, and his skin still deathly pale, and the scarred man crouched down to look at Nathan, then at Claire with a blade-sharp stare, his fingers pressing briefly against Nathan's neck to find a pulse before he stepped back and issued a low, commanding order, saying, "He is alive. Call an ambulance now." And she heard the hurried footsteps of one of the men as he pulled out a phone, his voice urgent but remarkably controlled. And just as she tried to speak, the scarred man turned his gaze on her again and asked, "What did you do to him?" A question that struck her like a blow as she glanced at Nathan, then back at the man, trying to steady her voice, though her thoughts were whirling as she answered that he had been poisoned, that she recognized the signs, that she only tried to help him breathe, and that without it he might have died. And though the man's eyes did not soften, they no longer burned with anger, as he signaled one of the others and said, "Get the coffee cup," and Claire swallowed hard when she remembered the bitter almond scent that still clung faintly to her tongue, while the bodyguard bent down to pick up the cup with the kind of caution reserved for acid, and the scarred man looked at her again as if searching every corner of her mind before asking who she was and what her name was. And she said, "Claire? Claire Bennett," that she worked here, her voice small but clear enough for all of them to hear, and he gave a slight nod without looking away from her as a distant siren grew louder. An ambulance racing toward them with red and blue lights flashing across the diner's windows, and he turned to the other two and ordered them to let the medics in when they arrived, but to keep everyone else away unless he allowed it. And Nathan stirred faintly, his eyes slitting open as if fighting his way back from unconsciousness, prompting Claire to lean closer, with her hand trembling as she touched his forehead and whispered, "You are going to be all right," though she was not certain whether she meant it for him or for herself, when heavy footsteps sounded behind her, and a police officer entered with his hand resting on his holster and demanded to know what was happening, and the scarred man stepped forward, flipping open a false badge and speaking in the steady tone of a trained security agent, saying they were handling a medical emergency, that a man had been poisoned, and that everyone needed to keep their distance until medical personnel arrived. And though the officer hesitated, he lifted his radio and called for backup, and Claire felt as if she had stumbled into an old black-and-white film where everything moved too quickly, and she was nothing more than an accidental witness caught in the current, until the scarred man's gaze returned to her one more time, no longer filled with suspicion but with something else, something that felt like a warning, as he stepped close and lowered his voice to a near whisper, saying, "From this moment on, you are no longer an outsider." Claire sat on the cold metal chair inside a small room behind the diner, a space the police had hastily turned into a temporary interrogation room, and although the air still carried the faint scent of old coffee and cooking grease, no one seemed to notice any of it now, as she kept her hands on her lap, trying not to let anyone see how they trembled, while a middle-aged officer with streaks of gray in his hair flipped through his notebook and studied her with the uncertain look of someone trying to decide whether she was a witness, a suspect, or both. And outside the fading wail of the ambulance siren had already gone silent as the medical team pushed the stretcher bearing Nathan toward the waiting vehicle, its flashing red and blue lights painting the ceiling in fleeting strokes of color, and Claire could hear hurried footsteps, clipped medical instructions, and finally the heavy slam of the ambulance doors, her heart pounding hard as she realized that Nathan might not survive if he did not receive immediate care, and the officer set his pen down, fixing her with a stern yet faintly puzzled gaze, as he said that he needed her to recount exactly what had happened from the beginning, and Claire drew a slow breath, her mind still spinning from the chaos, before she began to describe everything step by step, from the moment Nathan walked into the diner with that strange tension in his posture, the way he sat alone in the corner keeping his coat wrapped tightly around him despite the mild weather, the subtle tremor in his hand as he held the coffee cup, the bitter almond scent she had smelled and instantly recognized from her toxicology class, and then how he began to fade, how instinct took over and she acted without thinking, using a form of mouth-to-mouth support that was neither standard nor taught but was the only thing she could think of in that moment. And the officer listened without interrupting, and when she finished he asked a single simple question, whether she knew who the man was, and Claire shook her head before pausing, as the memory of the guarded stares of the men who accompanied Nathan and the scarred man's whispered warning echoed through her mind, prompting her to correct herself softly, saying she did not really know, only that she guessed he was important, and the officer wrote that down, nodding slowly as he glanced out the window where the ambulance had already vanished down the road, leaving only a fading smear of red behind, before turning back to her with an expression less severe than before, and telling her that she had done well and saved a life, but that he needed to be honest and warn her that this might not be the last time they spoke about this. And Claire nodded quietly as unease grew inside her like an undercurrent too deep to name, and a female officer stepped into the room to speak to the detective in a low voice before he motioned for Claire to stand, explaining that they would take her to the station for a formal report and an audio-recorded statement, that it would not take long but was necessary, and Claire rose, her eyes still drifting toward the door through which Nathan had been carried, her mind clinging to the last image of him, slipping into unconsciousness with a look of terror and confusion as he realized he was dying without understanding why, and she had never imagined she would come so close to witnessing death, not here in the diner where she worked night after night just to stay afloat and finish her final year of nursing school, and a draft of cold air slipped through the doorway, making her shiver as she stepped out of the room, and found the scarred man still standing guard near the entrance, and this time he said nothing, only gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod that for some inexplicable reason sent her heartbeat surging, because something had shifted, something had begun, and it would not end here. Claire left the police station just as dawn was beginning to lighten the sky, the air still cold and gray like the lingering breath of a storm that had not yet fully formed, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself as she walked quickly toward the bus stop, where only a few scattered early riders waited in silence, each step stretching the growing sense of uncertainty and unease tightening inside her chest, because she had no idea what waited for her after the strange rescue she had been pulled into, only the steady, unsettling feeling that nothing had ended there, that something was following her like a shadow she could not outrun, and the bus rolled through the mist-soaked streets while the streetlights cast smudged reflections across the glass and onto her tired face as she leaned her head against the window, trying to coax herself into a shallow, broken sleep. Yet her mind kept circling the images of the night before. Nathan's stunned eyes, the scarred man's gun, and the whispered warning that still crawled across her skin. And when she got off the bus, she hurried past 2 rows of quiet houses toward the old building where she lived. Her small apartment perched above a tiny bakery that opened only during daylight hours, and she climbed the familiar stairs with her heart pounding, without knowing if it was from the cold or from the instinctive dread clawing at her ribs. Then stopped short because her door was ajar, and she remembered with absolute clarity locking it before leaving the night before, her fingers tightening around the keys as her hand trembled. Yet she pushed the door open gently, and it swung inward without a sound, revealing her apartment looking almost the same as she had left it, but not quite. With the coffee mug she had left on the table now sitting crooked on the kitchen counter, a few books pulled out of the bookshelf in no particular order, and the blanket that had been on the couch now hanging limply on the floor. Nothing stolen, but everything touched. Unmistakable proof that someone had been inside. And Claire stepped carefully into the room, as though wading into unfamiliar water, checking every cabinet, every corner, the bathroom, the bedroom, even the small balcony behind the kitchen, finding no one but seeing signs that felt like a silent message, one that did not need words to say, "I know who you are, I know where you live." And she sank onto her bed with her hands clutching her head as her heart hammered out of her control, while fear swept through her in a way that was nothing like the distant unease of a horror movie, but something real and near enough that she could almost feel its breath on the back of her neck. And she grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts only to turn it off again. Because who could she call? The police, who would think she was imagining things, friends she barely had, family she refused to drag into this. And she bit her lip to steady herself before getting up to wipe down every surface that stranger hands might have touched, cleaning as she looked around, hoping to find some invisible evidence even though there was none. But the absence of proof did not mean she was safe. And though dawn's first light crept gently through the window, it brought her no comfort because the little world she had built for herself had been breached, and she was no longer sure she could ever feel secure again. And the only question echoing clearly in her mind like a ringing bell was why someone like Nathan Cross had been poisoned, and why she was the one who had saved him. A question whose answer she could feel drawing near, close enough to touch, close enough perhaps that it had already stepped through her door long before she ever had the chance to lock it. Claire did not sleep at all that night, sitting upright on her bed with her back against the wall and her eyes fixed on the window where the first pale strands of dawn were beginning to seep through, and outside the city slowly awakened with the familiar sounds of traffic, horns, and early footsteps that felt almost suffocating in their normalcy, while inside her everything was turning in restless circles as she thought about the shifted coffee cup, the books pulled out of place, and the cold shock that had pierced her when she opened the apartment door that only she should have had the key to. And in that moment of silence she wondered how someone like her, an ordinary young woman trying simply to survive this city, had stumbled into such chaos, because Claire Bennett, 27 years old, living alone in a small rented apartment above the bakery where she bought bread every Saturday morning, had never been the kind of person the world noticed, having lost her mother to cancer 3 years earlier, just before she finished her second year of nursing school, and her father long gone since elementary school, leaving her and her mother to battle rent, overdue bills, and long nights without electricity. And Claire had never had much but had also never asked for much, choosing nursing not out of dreams of prestige but because she had watched her mother suffer, lonely and overlooked by a system that moved too fast for people like her. And Claire wanted, in whatever small ways she could, to give others what her mother never received: a clean blanket, a glass of water at the right moment, an unjudging gaze, and to pay for her education and her life. She worked the night shift at the Red Pines Diner, a place unremarkable except for the fact that its lights stayed on when the rest of the city slept, and each night she served truck drivers, drunks, exhausted couples, and strangers who merely needed a place to exist for a few quiet hours. And she listened, observed, but never intervened, because Claire avoided trouble, kept her distance, dodged long conversations and curious men, living by the simple rule that the fewer people who knew who she was, the easier it was to breathe. And yet in a single instant, when she knelt and saw the fading eyes of Nathan Cross, every one of those rules had shattered as she acted on instinct like the nurse she hoped to become, like a human being who could not stand by and watch someone die. But now she was facing what no textbook had ever taught her: the unwanted attention, the invisible danger, and the unsettling knowledge that her life had veered down a path with no return. And Claire knew she was not special, not stronger or smarter than anyone else, But she had intuition, and that intuition told her that the man whose life she saved with her own breath belonged to a world she had never entered, a world that could swallow someone like her without leaving a trace. Yet somewhere deep inside she felt something else, not only fear but a fragile thread of connection between her and that man, Nathan Cross. A name now carved into her thoughts, not only because he had almost died in front of her, but because of the way he had looked at her. Not like a waitress, but like someone he had once known or once trusted, and Claire did not know what that meant. But she knew with absolute certainty that the night had changed her forever. And if she truly was no longer an outsider, as the scarred man had warned, then perhaps it was time to understand why and where she was meant to begin. Nathan woke in a dim room with a white-painted ceiling and a soft glow slipping through the edge of the curtain, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with the steady hum of the heart monitor was the first thing he registered as his throat lay dry, and his skull throbbed as though someone were striking it with a hammer, yet his awareness sharpened by degrees, and when he flexed a finger and then his hand, he understood he was still alive. And beside the bed stood a man in black as still as a statue. Tony, his most loyal guard, the one with the scar running down his left cheek that made strangers step aside on sight. And Tony said nothing but gave a small nod when he saw Nathan's eyes open before stepping out of the room, returning moments later with the organization's private doctor carrying a thick folder and a grave expression as he told Nathan that his survival was a miracle, that the toxin found in his blood was a variant of cyanide, potent and formulated to hide its scent when dissolved in hot coffee, and that without immediate intervention he would not still be here. And Nathan said nothing as he closed his eyes for a heartbeat and then opened them again, his mind locking onto every memory he could retrieve. The small diner, the coffee, Claire's final stunned look, the burning in his chest, and then one name rising like a blade through the fog, Miles, and he pushed himself upright, ripping the IV from his arm and saying he needed to speak with Tony immediately. And though the doctor began to protest, he fell silent after one glance at Nathan's eyes and left the room, and Tony returned moments later, shutting the door behind him as Nathan straightened, his voice low but sharp as steel when he asked who had touched his coffee after it was poured. And Tony did not answer right away, instead glancing down at a sheet of paper he had clearly prepared, explaining that the exterior cameras at the diner had been down, but witnesses confirmed that the coffee had been poured by the waitress, and that no one approached it afterward except Miles, and Nathan remained silent though his eyes narrowed as he recalled that Miles had brought the food, set it down himself, touched nothing else, eaten nothing, drunk nothing, and though his voice was rough, each word cut the air like a wound, as Tony nodded slowly and admitted they suspected the same, but did not want to speak without proof, and Nathan leaned back against the pillow staring up at the ceiling, remembering over 20 years beside Miles, from their early days on the streets to building an underground network spanning 3 states, Miles who knew the combination to the main safe, Miles who once knew the password to his phone, Miles who now might have tried to end everything with a single cup of coffee, and Nathan whispered the girl's name, Claire Bennett, asking if that was correct, and Tony confirmed it, explaining they were verifying her background as a nursing student working night shifts at the diner to pay tuition, with no record and no ties to any criminal groups, an ordinary person, and Nathan closed his eyes as her face surfaced in his mind, like a strange shard of memory lit with fear and brightness. A girl who had no reason to help him yet reacted faster than anyone on his own team ever had, and when he woke, Miles had been gone, vanished into the night, and when Nathan opened his eyes again, the emotion there was no longer anger but something heavier, loss, suspicion, and the bitter realization that loyalty was often the cheapest currency in their world, and he said he wanted to see Miles but not yet, telling Tony to let him believe Nathan was still unconscious, to let him think the plan had worked, and though Tony frowned he understood at once, because in their world information was power and surprise was the sharpest weapon, and Nathan leaned forward, pressing a hand to his forehead as the physical pain pulsed faintly, while the deeper wound settled elsewhere, in the place where trust had just been pierced clean through. Tony left the hospital room only a few minutes after receiving the order, and yet those few minutes were enough for everything to begin shifting, because in the world Nathan had built, information always came before action, and to uncover a traitor within a network where everyone knew how to erase their own footprints required more than speed. It demanded absolute patience. While Nathan remained still on the bed, feigning exhaustion and the fog of partial consciousness, Tony and 2 trusted men began retracing every step of the previous night, one of them returning to the Red Pines diner to question witnesses and gather whatever nearby footage he could find, even though most cameras had been disabled, while the other shadowed Miles, noting every movement, every phone call, every stop he made. Miles did not show up at the hospital. did not send flowers, did not ask about Nathan's condition through anyone in the organization. And that alone was strange, because in nearly 20 years, Miles had always been the first to reach Nathan whenever something went wrong. Yet this time he vanished as if he had never been part of their world at all. Tony delivered the report that same evening, while Nathan sat staring out the hospital window at the treetops turning color beneath the street lamps. And when Nathan asked without looking back where he had gone, Tony waited a moment before answering that Miles's office remained open but empty, his car sitting in the lot as usual. But since morning he had visited 3 locations outside his normal routine. The first a southern dock, the second Vargas's old car wash, and the third the apartment of a cousin who had died 3 years earlier. Nathan turned, his brows tightening as he asked if Tony was certain, and Tony nodded, saying it had been confirmed with photos and that Miles might be meeting someone or hiding something, and Nathan fell silent for a long stretch before leaning back, his eyes darkening as though searching an old corner of memory no one else was allowed to see. He instructed Tony to send men to each location, but not to approach, only to watch, to record, to act only when he gave the order, and Tony understood exactly what that meant, that Nathan was not yet ready to accuse Miles. That even though the signs grew clearer with each hour, he still needed a final confirmation, not to protect his own life but to protect what remained of the history they shared. That night Nathan asked Tony to bring him a small wooden box hidden deep in the basement safe of their main headquarters, and inside were old photographs, documents, and a worn, dark brown leather notebook, where he and Miles had once written the first principles they lived by when they built everything from nothing. And on the first page was a line written in faded black ink that read, "If one day I betray you, let me die in the silence I chose." And Nathan read that line again and again without speaking before closing the notebook, because he did not want to believe it. Yet his heart was no longer steady, and Miles's silence now felt like the loudest scream Nathan could no longer pretend not to hear. The phone vibrated just as Claire was folding her clothes in her small apartment, a simple daily chore that today felt heavy with tension. And when she glanced down, she saw no name on the screen, only an unfamiliar number with an area code she did not recognize, and her hand hesitated for a single second before she answered, her chest tightening with the certainty that this was not an ordinary call. "Miss Bennett?" a man's voice said, low and clear, unfamiliar yet not entirely strange. "I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Nathan Cross. He would like to meet you, privately." Once, Claire gripped the phone tighter, feeling her pulse hammering at her throat, and she did not reply immediately as her mind spun through a storm of thoughts, imagining seeing again the man whose life she had saved, the man newspapers and police avoided naming, the man who, waking up after that night, had somehow upended the quiet orbit of her life. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I'm not part of his world. I just did what anyone should do in an emergency." The line was silent for a few seconds before the man continued, his tone still calm but lower now, as though to make clear that this invitation was not merely a polite request. "Mr. Cross only wants to thank you. And to explain a few things you may need to know. About why you're being followed. About what is actually happening." Claire sank onto the edge of the bed, her hand pressed to her forehead, unable to deny that she had been living with a constant thread of fear since that night. And the feeling of being watched was not paranoia anymore. Someone had broken into her apartment, she had heard footsteps behind her on street corners, and strange cars had been parked outside the bakery under her building more than once. But meeting Nathan meant stepping completely into a world she did not understand and might never escape. I need time," she whispered. "I'm not sure I want to be involved in any of this." The man did not interrupt, but the silence that followed pressed against her like a weight, and at last he said, "You have 24 hours. After that, the invitation is no longer valid, and it is possible that the protection you currently have will no longer be in place." The call ended immediately after that. No goodbye, no chance to respond. Claire sat motionless, staring at the dark phone screen while her heart pounded wildly, and she knew she could no longer pretend nothing had happened, because whether she wanted it or not, the name Nathan Cross had already become part of a reality she could not erase. Yet she was not ready to take even a single step toward him. Not now, not when she still had no idea what she was truly up against. The next morning, Claire left her apartment earlier than usual, needing air, needing to pull herself away from the 4 walls that had begun to feel suffocating. And though she had spent the entire night turning the phone call over in her mind, she still had no answer. The streets grew gradually busier as the city awakened, people moving in their familiar rhythms, everything seeming to slide back into its ordinary orbit, even as nothing felt ordinary inside Claire's mind. She slipped in her earphones and walked quickly past the intersection near the nursing school where she had a morning lab, and as the light turned green, she stepped into the crosswalk, her eyes lowered to her phone to check the time, when a shriek of a car horn sliced through the air. In the span of a heartbeat, a black SUV shot toward her from the left, blowing through the red light and barreling in her direction like a looming shadow, and Claire barely managed to lift her head as her entire body locked in place before a hand grabbed her and yanked her backward with such force that she fell hard onto the sidewalk, the impact sending pain searing through her hip as the vehicle swept past her by inches and disappeared into the rush of traffic. Claire gasped for breath, her heart pounding so violently it felt lodged in her throat, and the man who had pulled her back was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and dark glasses with no expression on his face. He looked at her for a brief second before pulling out his phone and speaking 3 words in a voice cold as steel. They reached her. Then, without waiting for a reply, he slipped the phone away and helped Claire to her feet as she trembled in shock. And before she could speak, she noticed another black car parked neatly at the curb with its rear door already open. The man kept a steady hand on her shoulder as he said quietly but with unmistakable firmness, "Mr. Cross ordered us to bring you somewhere safe." And Claire shook her head, the words flying from her mouth on instinct, saying she did not know who they were or where they intended to take her. She could not go with him, but he did not show anger, only dropping his voice lower as he said that if she refused, next time it would not be a near miss, that she had already been warned. Claire looked around, seeing that pedestrians had resumed their pace and no one was paying attention to her or the car, and her heart still thundered in her chest as she realized she had escaped a blade's edge by a single breath, yet also understood that if she continued to hesitate, if she kept pretending her life had not changed, she would not get another chance. She stepped into the car without another word, and the man slid in beside her, silent, his eyes behind the dark lenses tracking every movement beyond the window as the vehicle glided smoothly into the flow of the city, leaving behind the intersection that might otherwise have become the scene of a fatal accident that morning. And Claire leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes, understanding now that there was no escape and that perhaps she no longer had any other choice. The car brought Claire to a secluded estate nestled deep within a quiet wooded area north of the city, a place with no signs, no grand gate, only a stone-paved road cutting between 2 towering rows of pines and steel fencing hidden behind dense greenery. And when the vehicle stopped, the door opened without a word as the man who had escorted her gave a slight nod for her to proceed while he remained in the car. Claire stepped into the house where soft, golden light spilled across polished wooden floors, and a warm, uncanny stillness filled the air, and a woman in a simple uniform led her through a long hallway before stopping at the final door. "Mr. Cross is waiting for you," she whispered before retreating, and Claire stood motionless for a single breath before pushing the door open. Inside was a wide room with measured lighting, a high ceiling, dark paneled walls, several shelves of books, and a fireplace burning fiercely in the corner, and Nathan Cross sat in an armchair beside the window, wearing a white shirt with a faint bandage visible beneath the fabric on his right arm. He turned when Claire entered, his eyes sharp as a blade yet free of threat, the gaze of a man who had lived too long in a world where trust was a luxury, and who had only narrowly escaped death by betrayal. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and rough as though he had just woken from a long fevered dream, and Claire stood still with her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she tried to conceal her tension. "I didn't have much of a choice," she replied, her eyes fixed on him, and Nathan nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. "I know what happened to you this morning. I should have acted sooner." Claire frowned, unable to hide her frustration and confusion. "I don't understand. I'm just a waitress. I helped you because I'm a nursing student, not because I know who you are. I don't belong to any of this. I don't want to." Nathan remained silent for a few seconds before rising and walking toward her, stopping close enough that their eyes met head-on but not close enough to overwhelm, and he said, "I understand, but you saved my life, and that makes you part of a story you didn't choose. Believe me, I've been in that position before." Claire exhaled, feeling the wall of defense inside her waver slightly, not because of his words alone but because of the look in his eyes, the look of someone who had once stood exactly where she was standing now. "Who wants to kill you?" she asked, her voice for the first time open. Nathan did not answer immediately, instead turning his gaze toward the fire where the flames cast shadows across part of his face and revealed the exhaustion pooling at the corners of his eyes. "Someone I trusted," he said quietly. "Someone who walked beside me for over 20 years, and that person chose the cup of coffee you poured to end everything." A chill ran down Claire's spine as she recalled the man who had accompanied Nathan that night, wondering whether it had been him or another hidden figure. "And now?" she asked. Nathan turned back to her, and his eyes no longer held sharpness but something heavier, a weight that could not be named. "Now I need to know who is behind him, and I need to make sure the people who shouldn't die for this don't." For reasons she could not fully understand, those words made her lower herself into the chair across from him, and for a few seconds the room fell into a silence so deep that the only sound was the crackling of the fire, a fragile calm suspended over an invisible storm. But in that fragile moment Claire felt perhaps for the first time that she was no longer just an outsider, and that a delicate but unmistakably real bond had begun to form between two people who should have remained strangers, and she knew that from this point on there was no path back to the life she had known. Claire sat still in the leather chair across from him, her gaze fixed on Nathan's face where the usual steel-like detachment had given way to something else, a muted ache buried so deeply it barely surfaced, and he remained silent for a long moment, as though weighing whether to open a door he had locked away years ago. At last he spoke, his voice slow and measured, each word carrying the weight of time. "Miles and I met for the first time in an orphanage. We were both 11, both left behind on holidays. We had no relatives, no birthday gifts, nothing except each other. Back then I didn't even have a real name, just a number on a file. Miles was the one who called me Nathan. He said if I didn't have a name, then I needed one strong enough that no one would dare forget it." Claire did not interrupt as he continued, his gaze drifting somewhere far beyond the room. "We grew up together, stepped into the world together. Every step I took had Miles's footprint beside it. When I started my first operation, Miles drove the car. When I negotiated with other groups, he stood behind me. We weren't friends, we were brothers. Once, I was ambushed at the docks. I was badly injured, nearly bled out. Miles wrapped my wounds with his own shirt. He sat beside me the entire night, gun in hand, eyes never blinking. I swore then that if anything ever happened, my assets, my life, I would leave them to him." Nathan paused, his hands tightening slightly. "And now Miles is the one who put poison in my coffee. No one else is close enough to do that without being noticed. No one else knows I always drink it black but will never refuse if someone offers a small packet of vanilla. Miles knew. He bought that exact packet, set it on the table, smiled, and watched me drink." Claire leaned forward slightly, her voice soft as wind. "Are you certain? Maybe someone is framing him?" Nathan shook his head sharply. "I have never been more certain. He didn't look at me like a friend when I began to feel dizzy. He looked at me like a doctor observing a test subject. No fear, no regret, only anticipation." A chill crawled down Claire's spine. She could not fathom the weight of such betrayal, coming from the closest person in his life, the one who had once saved him, the one who had given him his first name. She said nothing, letting Nathan continue. "What keeps me from acting immediately is the question of why. He doesn't need money. He doesn't need power. I gave both to him long ago. If he wanted control, all he needed was to ask and I would have stepped aside. Yet he chose to kill me. Quietly, cleanly, without trace. Not the death of an enemy, but the disposal of a burden." Nathan lifted his gaze to hers, and in his eyes she saw a mixture of grief and horror. "I don't know what makes a person change like that. Or maybe he never changed. Maybe I simply refused to see it sooner." Claire remained silent for a long time before speaking. "What will you do when you see him again?" Nathan looked toward the window where the afternoon light had begun to fade. "I don't know, but I do know this. I am no longer the brother he once knew, and I cannot allow him to be the last person I trust. Not anymore." Claire had not expected to agree to stay, yet when Nathan's gaze lingered on her after the story of Miles, there was something in it she could not turn away from. An unspoken plea, a silence that made her feel that if she stepped through that door now, the world outside would never be the same again, and she gave a small nod, as though she herself barely believed her own decision, but felt an inexplicable sense of relief when the room closed behind her and she was led to a guest room on the second floor. The room was simple yet warm, with a large window overlooking a shaded backyard and furnishings arranged with the quiet intimacy of a family home, rather than the headquarters of an underground network people whispered about in fear. In the first days, Claire spent most of her time in her room, avoiding the men in the hallways who looked more like mercenaries than household staff. But then she began to notice things. The older man who tended the garden every morning, trimming hedges and watering plants at the exact same hour, the middle-aged woman who brewed coffee and brought Nathan a cup, always the same kind she once poured for him at the diner. The little blonde girl, perhaps 8 years old, who played in the back garden each afternoon with one of the guards, her laughter echoing through the trees, and Nathan himself standing on the balcony watching it all, silent, neither drinking nor smoking, simply standing with his hands in his pockets and eyes deep as though pulled into thoughts too heavy to name. One evening she went downstairs for water and found Nathan in the kitchen alone, wearing an apron and awkwardly slicing tomatoes, and she froze in the doorway until he turned, offering a faintly embarrassed smile as he said he was not very good at this but was learning, and she stepped closer, unable to hold back a soft laugh at the uneven slices. She asked who was teaching him, and he said a chef who once served as a naval operative and now ran his kitchen had told him he needed to cook at least one decent dinner if he wanted people to believe he was still human. Claire shook her head, took the knife, and began to redo the pile of vegetables, and in those brief minutes beside him she realized Nathan was not what she had imagined a crime lord to be, not cold to the point of cruelty nor radiating dominance, but a man who had seen too much, lost too much, living inside the armor he built to protect himself from the world and from his own buried emotions. He did not smile often, but when he did his eyes softened. He spoke little about himself, yet enough for her to sense he was no longer the kind of man power could blind. One night, woken by thunder, she went downstairs for water and found Nathan sitting alone in the study holding an old photograph, and though he startled when he saw her, he did not hide it. The picture showed him and Miles, younger, standing before an old garage with bright smiles and arms around each other, and Claire saw the pain in Nathan's eyes more clearly than ever. In that moment she understood that whatever Nathan had done, whatever orders he had given, whatever darkness he had lived in, beneath it all he was still human, and somehow that frightened her more than the guns in the house, because it made her want to stay. 4 days after Claire decided to stay, a confidential report was placed in Nathan's hands near midnight as he sat in his study beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp, his eyes unblinking as he turned page after page filled with dense information, satellite images, snippets of wiretapped conversations, and encrypted bank transfers, each fragment clicking into place like a haunting jigsaw puzzle until the final picture emerged and seemed to drain the room of warmth. Miles, the sworn brother who had stood beside him through fire and blood, had been in contact with and exchanging information with the Tijuana cartel, one of the most notorious groups south of the border, and a short but unmistakable audio recording captured Miles's voice negotiating with a cartel boss about dividing a new opioid route through California if the old man was removed cleanly. The name was never spoken, but everyone knew it meant Nathan. Funds funneled from a shell company in San Diego had been deposited into a virtual investment account under the name of Miles's ex-wife and then withdrawn in cash. A devoted accountant loyal to Nathan had vanished after discovering discrepancies in the money flow, and his body had been found 30 miles away in the trunk of an abandoned car, his pinky fingers severed as a silent warning. Nathan stopped reading at that point, set the report down, and leaned back in his chair with his eyes closed, his hands still clenched. And in the darkness of the study he was no longer the cold, commanding figure the world feared, but a man who had just lost the final flicker of hope that he might have been wrong about the only brother he ever had. Tony, Nathan's right hand, entered without knocking, and placed a USB drive on the desk containing a surveillance clip from a hidden camera in a restaurant in El Paso that showed Miles seated across from a tattooed Mexican man, the ink covering half his neck as they clinked glasses and laughed, and Nathan did not need to hear the conversation. That single moment alone was enough to kill any remaining doubt. When Claire stepped into the room, Nathan was still motionless, the air so heavy it felt suffocating, and he did not look up when she gently asked what had happened, instead extending a hand to push a thin folder toward her. She took it, flipped it open, and read, unable to understand every technical term in the report yet sharp enough to assemble the pieces and grasp the depth of the betrayal. When she reached the section where Miles promised to hand over the locations of Nathan's warehouses in exchange for the cartel's support for a smooth transfer of power, her expression darkened, and when she lifted her gaze she found Nathan watching the floor as his voice emerged low and rough like gravel scraping the bottom of a glass. I always thought that if I ever died, at least it would be by the hand of an enemy worthy of it. But the one who brought me closest to death was the person I trusted more than blood. Claire did not know when she had moved to sit beside him, her hand resting lightly against his elbow as a silent presence, and Nathan turned toward her with eyes drained but clear. If I don't act first, Miles won't stop. And next time it might not just be me. It could be you. Claire knew he was right, and what frightened her was not the truth exposed on the pages but the growing emotion inside her, the concern for someone she never expected to care about. Part of her wanted to rise, run, escape the web of power and betrayal tightening around them, Yet another part could not turn away from the man sitting silently before her amid the shattered pieces of trust broken by a brother's hand. Claire understood then that the game had shifted into a new phase. And this time, blood might be the only language left. Nathan summoned Miles to meet him on a gray, heavy afternoon without warning and without explanation, choosing an old warehouse by the river, where in their earliest days they once exchanged small shipments and dreamed reckless dreams. And Tony, with 2 guards, stood far off under Nathan's direct order not to enter because he wanted this to be between the 2 of them, the way it had always been. When Miles walked in, his eyes were still the familiar eyes of a brother, of the man who had stood beside Nathan through fire and grief, who had held him during the nights he mourned his wife, who had shared whiskey with him after every victory and every loss. Yet today that look was something Nathan could see through completely. Miles laughed, clapped a hand on his shoulder, and asked with a false casual warmth whether he was feeling better after the poisoning, while Nathan stared back without blinking, a part of him still wishing every piece of evidence had been wrong, still hoping it was all a trap designed to tear them apart. But truth, like a cold blade, remained lodged in his chest. He did not show the files, the audio, or the photographs. Instead, he asked one question, his voice low and rough, not angry but searching for whatever piece of Miles's soul might still remain. "Why?" Miles faltered for a heartbeat before forcing a familiar old smile. "Why what?" "Why I still haven't taught you to play golf." Nathan said nothing, and the silence pulled the smile off Miles's face. He removed his hand from Nathan's shoulder, stepped back half a pace, and blinked. "You know, don't you?" Nathan gave a small nod, the kind that sealed the final truth. "Everything. I know, and I'm waiting for the reason." Miles exhaled, glancing toward the cracked warehouse window. "You've changed, Nathan. We were 2 kids kicking down the world's door just to survive. Now you've built a castle and expect everyone else to kneel. You rule with silence and that knife-sharp stare. And I've become a numb limb you no longer use. I didn't betray you for money. I betrayed you because I don't see myself in your kingdom anymore." Nathan listened, feeling waves rise inside him without a name, remembering the afternoons they sat on the roof of a stolen truck staring at the city, dreaming of power and a place in a world that never wanted them, never knowing that power chooses, divides, elevates one, leaves the other shrinking in the shadow. He stepped close, his eyes reddening with restraint. "All you had to do was say one sentence. One, I would have given you your share, let you walk away clean, let us drink a beer without staring at each other like 2 men ready to pull the trigger. But instead of speaking, you poisoned me." Miles met Nathan's gaze without flinching for the first time. "Because I knew if I asked, you would give. And I don't want your mercy. I wanted to take it back with my own hands." Inside Nathan, fury and heartbreak tore against each other, anger choking his voice while something hollow spread in his chest. He had always believed he could end Miles if he had to, believed betrayal was the one unforgivable line, yet standing in front of the man who had been his brother, the one who still said his name the way he did as a boy, Nathan could not give the order, not out of fear, but out of sorrow, because part of him was still unable to let go. He turned away, his voice scraped raw. "Get out, Miles, before I change my mind." Miles stood there a moment longer before walking out, his back straight, his steps unhurried, and when the door closed, Nathan remained still, staring into the empty space before him as if searching for something he had lost. And Claire, who had watched from a distance since the beginning, understood that the worst pain was not betrayal itself, but the unbearable truth that he could do nothing about it. Claire sat alone in the living room of the safe house, the soft amber light falling across her loose brown hair as her eyes remained fixed on the cooling cup of tea in her hands, while her mind drifted back to the confrontation between Nathan and Miles only hours earlier. And although she had not heard every word, she had seen the way Nathan stood, silent as a man carrying the weight of an entire world, and that alone told her everything she needed to know. A part of her felt stranded between 2 cliffs. She did not belong to Nathan's world and had no desire to be pulled into its cold calculations, its betrayals, its jagged power struggles. She was a nurse, someone who had spent sleepless nights memorizing antidotes, allergic reactions, cardiac emergencies so she could save lives, not become a living witness in a hidden war between men who once swore to die for each other and then tried to poison one another with a cup of coffee. Yet the farther she wished to step away, the deeper she felt herself being drawn in, not by threats, not by promises, but by the look in Nathan's eyes when he turned away from Miles, his voice trembling as though containing an ocean of emotion he could no longer name. She had seen that look in hospitals, In the eyes of husbands who had lost their wives, children who had lost their mothers, the look of absolute helplessness before a loss no one could language. Claire could not stop thinking. If Nathan had truly died that day by Miles's hand, would anyone else have had the courage to see the truth the way she had? Would anyone have been there to pull him back when his last breath slipped away? And if she walked away now, choosing to return to the life she once knew, would she be allowing another tragedy to unfold unattended? But reason shouted in her mind that none of this was her responsibility, that she owed nothing to a world she did not choose, that she was not meant to stand between their decisions that carried life and death consequences far beyond anything a woman striving to finish nursing school in a city that barely knew her could ever bear. She remembered her old life, the quiet nights at the diner, the exhausting but peaceful days of study, the afternoons reading by the window with the hum of traffic drifting up from the street below. She had been so close to that dream, a stable job, a simple life, a small piece of calm in the world. And now all of it felt like something preserved only in memory. If she stayed, she was not sure she would ever find her way back, not sure she would even survive long enough to try. But Claire also knew there are moments in life when turning back means carrying regret for the rest of your days. And though she did not need protection, something inside her urged her to protect something far more fragile than safety: trust. And Nathan, for all his masks, for all the things he had done that she was not yet ready to forgive, was the only one who had not hidden his pain from her that night. When Claire finally lifted her gaze, there was no confusion left in her eyes, only resolve. She did not yet know what she would do, but she knew with absolute clarity that if she walked away now, she would never be able to forgive herself. That evening, the rain fell in a steady, whispering drizzle, each cold drop tapping against the windows like an unnamed omen, and Nathan left the safe house for an urgent meeting with a few trusted partners in the underground parking level of an abandoned hotel, taking only Tony and one more man with him out of habit and the need to avoid attention. The meeting ended quickly and seemed smooth enough until they stepped back out, and as the steel door closed behind them, Nathan sensed a strange, unnatural silence settling over the concrete space. And before he could turn, a burst of gunfire shattered the air. Tony reacted on instinct, dragging Nathan down behind an old car as rounds tore through concrete and shattered windshields. And no one needed to say it for them to know this was no random attack. This was an execution, and the hand behind it could only be Miles. 4 masked men emerged from the shadows, moving like specters, their hands steady on their weapons, and Nathan drew the handgun at his hip, blood seeping from a fresh cut on his arm where the glass had sliced him, but his eyes still sharp as ice. Tony shouted for backup through the radio, but the signal was dead, jammed long before they arrived, proof that the ambush had been meticulously prepared. Nathan understood that, unless a miracle intervened, this might be the last night he ever saw the gray sky above. Then a sudden crash echoed from the emergency stairwell, and one of the attackers was thrown backward, his head slamming against a concrete pillar before he collapsed unconscious. The remaining 3 spun around just as Claire burst out from behind a car, wielding a heavy fire extinguisher she had swung into the first man's skull. Amid the chaos, there was no fear in her movement. Instead, every strike and shift of her body was quick, decisive, fueled by something she herself might not have named. Nathan stared, stunned, unable to grasp how or why she was there. But before he could speak, Claire dropped beside him, breathless, whispering that she had heard Tony mention the meeting and something felt wrong, so she followed. He stared at her without blinking, because she was no soldier and she owed him nothing. Yet she had come without warning, without hesitation, without complaint. The last attacker fired, the bullet slicing past Claire's shoulder as she shoved Nathan to the ground a second time, and Tony's return shot found its mark. Silence washed over the garage, broken only by falling rain, and the ragged breathing of 3 still living people whose hearts were pounding hard enough to bruise bone. Nathan sat up, pain throbbing in his arm, but his eyes locked on Claire. She had a cut on her forehead, blood threading down her skin, though she seemed oblivious to it. "You think you're the only one who can save someone?" She spat through clenched teeth, and the words cut through the chaos like a blade. Something inside Nathan fractured and fused all at once, not because he had survived the ambush, but because for the second time on the border of life and death, the person who pulled him back was not a gunman or a loyal guard, but a nurse who did not belong to his world at all. When reinforcements finally arrived, Nathan was already on his feet, his arm around Claire as he helped her away from the haunted concrete. This time he felt no gratitude. He felt indebted. And in his world, a debt of blood was hard to erase, but a debt of mercy was harder still. 2 days after the ambush in the underground parking garage, Nathan sat in silence in the basement conference room of the suburban estate, the cold fluorescence casting a stark, muted glow across his face that sharpened him into something darker and more resolute than anyone there had ever seen. Before him lay a long ebony table, surrounded by the most trusted figures in his organization, and Tony stood at his right, watchful as always, though this time the room was thick with something unnamed, as if every man present were holding his breath in anticipation of a verdict. Nathan had no hesitation left. He needed no more evidence. The first attempt could have been chance. The second was proof, and the fact that Claire had nearly died saving him a second time had pushed him far beyond the limits of patience. He fixed his eyes on the gray-haired man whose wrists were bound, seated at the far end of the table. Miles no longer carried his usual confidence. His designer suit was wrinkled, dried blood clung to his mouth, his face bruised from a capture that had shown no mercy. Yet his gaze remained brazen, defiant, as if he still believed that 2 decades of brotherhood might be enough to save him once more. Nathan spoke in a low, steady voice, each word landing with the weight of stone striking stone as he told Miles he had given him everything: family, position, power, and had trusted him with his back for over 20 years, only to be repaid like this. Miles gave a crooked, bitter smile, warped by the swelling in his jaw, and told Nathan he was weak, that he had done what Nathan would not do, that he had protected the future of the organization, while Nathan let emotion cloud judgment, insisting that ever since the girl had appeared, Nathan was no longer himself. Nathan did not answer at once. He rose, walked slowly to where Miles sat, and looked at him closely, as though memorizing for the last time the face of the man who had once been the closest thing to a brother he had ever known. Then he said Miles was right. He had changed, but not because of her, because he had finally realized that keeping traitors close did not make him stronger, only weaker. He turned toward Tony, his voice sharp as cold metal, and ordered Miles locked away in Warehouse 3, guarded around the clock, no visitors, no conversation unless authorized, not allowed to die but never allowed comfort. Tony nodded without a word. It was a command no one would dare question. Miles shouted as he was dragged out, a sound caught somewhere between rage and despair, and Nathan did not look back. There was no room left in him for regret. He had spared Miles once, but there would not be a second time, and the price of mercy had nearly been his life. When the steel door clanged shut behind Miles, Nathan sank back into his chair, his entire body exhaling the weight he had carried for years, and he poured himself a glass of whiskey, swallowing the burn as it scorched down his throat. Claire stepped into the room without speaking, her eyes meeting his, and she understood without asking, for in his gaze there was no uncertainty left, only the look of a man who had chosen a path from which there was no return. Claire sat quietly beside the third-floor window of her old apartment, the small flower pots she had once tended still coated in dust after weeks of neglect, and the pale, gray December morning sky mirrored the emptiness settling inside her. It had been 3 days since she left the safe house, left Nathan's world, left everything that had never truly belonged to her, and their parting had not been marked by tears or romantic promises. They had simply looked at each other, and in that look, Claire saw the truth that if she stayed, she would lose herself. She had saved him twice, not for love but out of instinct, conscience, and the rare kindness that still survived within a world thick with lies. Yet the closer she came to Nathan, the more she felt herself pulled into a vortex that would swallow her whole if she did not escape in time, leaving nothing behind but the shadow of someone she had never chosen to become. Nathan had not tried to stop her. He understood, and that understanding hurt her more than anything. For sometimes people walk away not because they feel too little but because they feel too deeply. So deeply it becomes the very thing they fear most. Claire returned to her shift at the local clinic, where elderly patients greeted her with gentle eyes, where the scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of blood pressure machines shaped the familiar cadence of daily life. She forced a small smile at Dr. Mitchell, accepted her task list as though nothing in her world had been altered. Yet every time the clinic door opened, she flinched, and every time someone asked her name, she hesitated, as though afraid they would recognize a piece of the past she was trying to bury. At night she lay alone on her narrow bed, remembering the first night Nathan nearly died in her arms, remembering the way he looked at her after the second ambush, a look that carried gratitude deeper than words, and those memories refused to release her, slipping into her dreams and waking her with a pounding heart she could not name as fear or longing. She knew she had done the right thing, knew returning to her old life was the only way to protect her future, but the emptiness lingered like a hollow echo, as though some part of her had been left behind with the man whose storm-gray eyes and wounded heart seemed beyond healing. She did not call him or send a message or ask his men for news, even though she knew they still watched over her from afar. Instead, she stayed silent, hoping that with enough quiet, time would smooth away every jagged edge inside her. But time does not heal everything, and Claire soon understood that some people enter our lives not to stay, but to remind us that a vast, merciless, vivid world exists beyond the small corners we try to make safe, and that sometimes a brief moment between two strangers can change everything forever. 3 months later, the atmosphere inside the small Brooklyn clinic moved with the same quiet steadiness as a patient's heartbeat after an injection, and Claire stood in the emergency room, wrapping a bandage around the scraped leg of a little girl who had fallen off her bicycle, her gentle smile easing the child's tears, while the grateful mother thanked her again and again, as though Claire had healed a wound far larger than a patch of broken skin. She nodded, cleaned the last trace of blood, offered careful instructions, and watched them leave before settling at her desk to record the case, her hand moving quickly across the chart until the front door opened and footsteps sounded on the tiled floor with a steady, unmistakable rhythm. She did not look up, but her heart paused mid-beat as something familiar slipped into the air, the faint scent of sandalwood and smoke, a weighted silence that was not threatening yet impossible to ignore. It could only be him. Claire slowly raised her head, and exactly as she expected, Nathan Cross stood in the doorway without his leather jacket, without guards, without a gun at his side, only himself in a black shirt and an expression that made it seem as though the world had stopped the last time they saw each other. There were no polite greetings, no need for explanations. They simply looked at one another as if the past 3 months had been an intermission in a song that had not finished its final note. Claire rose quickly but did not move closer, her heart urging her forward even as her mind hesitated. Nathan walked toward her, stopping a few steps away, the afternoon light spilling through the window onto his face, revealing a slight hollowness in his cheeks, though his eyes were still the same storm-dark depths she had first seen in that diner months ago. His voice, low and worn at the edges, broke the silence. "Thank you for not forgetting how to save a life." Claire frowned, confused, until he reached into his pocket and held out a small photograph of a 6-year-old boy grinning brightly on a hospital bed. "The son of a man who once worked for me. He had a rare reaction to medication. No one knew what to do. But you were there. You saved him." She looked at the photo and then back at him, not understanding why he had come just to say that. Nathan folded the picture and slipped it away before continuing, every word sounding as though he had rehearsed it in his mind for a long time. "But that isn't the only reason I'm here. I left the organization. I handed over control. I want a real life, even if it means losing everything I built." Claire still said nothing, watching him, waiting for what she was afraid to hope for. "I didn't come to take you away. I only came to tell you that if one day you turn around, I'll be standing exactly where we left each other. No pressure, no conditions, just me. Not the man I used to be." Nathan stepped back, his gaze holding hers. "I owe you a new life. I just hope I'm not the part you choose to leave behind." Then he turned and walked out of the clinic, leaving Claire standing with the pen still clenched in her hand, the final line of her chart unfinished. She didn't call after him. She didn't run, but her heart had already taken its first small steps away from the wall she had built around it for 3 long months. And for the first time in many nights, she smiled not because he had returned, but because he had given her the right to choose. Since the day Nathan returned and then walked away in silence, Claire continued living her quiet months as a nurse, yet her heart was no longer the same. Each morning, when she unlocked the clinic door, she would look out at the busy street and wonder whether someone was watching her from afar, not with suspicion or fear, but with an invisible sense of connection she could not fully explain. The dreams about that night in the diner still visited her from time to time, no longer sharp but leaving behind a lingering ache that reminded her everything had changed from that single moment of fate. Nathan never came back again. No messages, no calls, no trace. Yet Claire understood. He did not need to appear for her to know he was still out there somewhere, living the new life he had promised, perhaps in another city under a clean name and identity, trying to make amends, or perhaps still somewhere in New York, quietly watching to make sure she remained safe. The debt between them had been paid with life, with his choice to walk away from power, with a wordless gratitude, but some things could not be settled by actions or time. The thread that connected two people from opposite worlds, who collided for only a brief and searing moment, had never snapped. It lived in the memory of a glance, in an unexpected smile when she recalled something, in the questions that had never been answered, and sometimes, as naturally as destiny itself, there were threads meant to stay. Not to bind people together, but to remind them that somewhere in this chaotic world, something true still exists even when born in the most dangerous place. The story of Claire and Nathan had no clear ending, because the things that truly matter in life rarely need endings to be complete. It is the choice to live according to conscience even when everything may be lost. The trust placed in a stranger in the most perilous moment. The forgiveness offered to those who once stood close but later brought pain, and above all, the quiet strength of humanity, the one force capable of changing a person's fate. If this story has moved you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. In what ways does Claire and Nathan's journey reflect real life to you? And have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between safety and what was right? Speak from your heart, for we are always eager to listen. And if you find meaning in this story, please remember to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can continue bringing you stories that touch the emotions day after day. In a world full of turmoil, we believe everyone deserves a quiet space to feel, to empathize, and to hope. Thank you for staying with us until the end of today's video. May you have health, peace, and something good to believe in and smile about each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.